Hey, it's me, Saul, and today we're starting the Photon 101 series here on the channel. Photons got some support in the form of Neo Galaxy Eyes, and as a result, I've been playing them quite a bit more. Now, I have a couple of ideas on how to build a Photon deck, but we're also going to be covering how to play a Photon deck in the series. We're going to cover how to summon Neo Galaxy Eyes onto the field, the most viable ways to go about it, and we are also going to be covering support that I think the deck could really use from the TCG in order to boost its potential in the meta. Now, today we're focusing on how to build a Photon deck. Let's get started. If I had to think of one word, one thing to keep in mind when building a Photon deck, it would be focus, right? You have a plan, you have something that you want to achieve with this deck, and you can't lose sight of it when deck building. This archetype is relatively linear in what it wants to achieve. You, most of the time, want to OTK your opponents, right? You can add more things into the deck if you would like to, a little bit of support here and there, but you don't want consistency to become an issue. So I recommend a compact deck list. Don't go above, I would say, the 20 to 22 card range. That way you're guaranteeing your opening hand a little bit more. Obviously it's not guaranteed, we don't have a skill like balance, but it makes it a lot easier to run smoothly when playing this deck if your deck list is tightly built. For that reason, I recommend the deck list that you're looking at right now. There are other variants and I will explain that the further we get into the video, but let's get started. I recommend that you run Photon Thrasher at 3 copies. Photon Thrasher is an amazing starting card. If you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. It's just a very, very good card to get your play started. Unfortunately, the downside to this card is it can only be used, well, when you control no monsters on the field, which means that if you've already gotten into your plays, it becomes a lot less useful, but it's a good starting card. Remember, we're trying to OTK our opponents, so opening well is the most important thing, which is why this card is run at 3 copies. The next card to consider is Photon Advancer. Now, this one is a bit more forgiving. It can be normal summoned, which is really, really good, but more importantly, if you control another Photon monster, you can special summon this card from your hand once per turn. If you do that, it gets a nice little attack boost, but that's not actually really what matters here. What matters is the ability to normal summon one of these cards and then special summon another one if you want to, or just using it to special summon alongside Thrasher. It's very flexible in what it allows you to do. I also recommend that you run this card at 3 copies. Photon Vanisher is, in my opinion, the best card in the archetype. This card, however, I recommend that you run at 2 copies, and here's why. Whereas Thrasher is a starting card and Advancer is a starting card where they allow you to normal summon themselves or special summon themselves and get your play started, Vanisher cannot be normal summoned or special summoned unless you control another Photon monster. What this means is, assuming that your OTK play does not work and you draw into Vanisher without having anything else at your disposal, there's a good chance you're going to be stuck. Despite that, however, and the reason why I call it the best card in the archetype is it's the only card that allows you to gain some card advantage, some significant card advantage, because when this card is special summoned, you can add a Galaxy Eyes from your deck to your hand, which means that you've gotten an extra resource in hand to use with the skill. We'll get to that later. Photon Lizard is an extremely important card in the archetype, the reason being that if this card is on the field, you contribute it and add any Photon monster from your deck to your hand. That is extremely, extremely important because not only does it thin the deck, but it allows you to start in the right way. It allows you to start in any way that you want, to be honest. Not only that, but because it's a Photon monster, you could normal summon this card, special summon an Advancer to go alongside it, then tribute this card to get a Vanisher, and just like that, you've got a great opening hand. Bear in mind that this card does take up a normal summon, but quite frankly, most of the cards in this archetype are special summoning themselves anyway, so the fact that this takes up a normal summon isn't really all that important. The only real concern is if you open on 2 or 3 of these at the same time. I run this at 2 copies because I only have 2 copies to run. Having multiple in your hand at once doesn't really help you in any given situation, but from what I've seen, and especially because, again, the use of the skill to return cards back into the deck, you will most likely be fine if you choose to run Photon Lizard at 3, but 2 has been working very, very well for me. Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon, the boss monster of the archetype. Now, I run this card at 2 copies in my deck. The reason being, I don't want it to turn into a brick, but I want to give myself another chance to try and recover in case the initial OTK fails, or in case a duel ends up being longer than I expect it to be. Not only that, but because Vanisher is helping me to add one of these cards into my hand, well, if I opened on one of these cards, and I only had one in the deck, Vanisher would be a lot less useful. It's my personal belief that 3 would be too many, 2 is absolutely fine, so have at it. That's pretty much the last thing I have to say about the monsters. Bear in mind, all of these cards can be obtained from the mini box Photon of Galaxy, which is really, really nice. The only exception to that is Advancer, because it was only obtainable in the Number Hunter Kite Tenjo event. It's completely free to play. If the event comes back, you can probably get the card, but that is currently the only way to obtain it. Now, the spells and traps in this deck currently are 100% debatable, but let me explain my reasoning as to why I included what I did and at the numbers that I did. As this is an OTK focused deck, I strongly recommend Hey True Nade, because if you do manage to open it, your initial combo just cannot be interrupted by most people's back row. It's very, very useful. I can't really think of a situation where I Hey True Naded my opponent's back row and had my, standard opening play where I didn't win the duel. So Hey True Nade, in my opinion, is essential for this deck. Now, you may be asking, Hey True Nade is very, very good for when you want to set up and get yourself started, but what if you don't open on the Hey True Nade? That is why I run Galaxy Cyclone in this deck, and I run Galaxy Cyclone at 1 copy. Not just because I only have one, but listen to my reasoning. Galaxy Cyclone is extremely good because it pairs with the skill Galaxy Photon. Galaxy Photon allows you to return one Galaxy or Photon monster from your hand into the deck, and then you can add one Galaxy or Photon spell or trap card from your deck to your hand. Well, you can only get one card out using the skill, so if your opponent has some back row set and you're looking to get your opening play started, one Galaxy Cyclone is all you would be able to search. Get the one Galaxy Cyclone, pop that back row, and then make your opening play that way. So in that instance, you're using the skill defensively rather than offensively the way that most people do. So yeah, the skill basically makes Galaxy Cyclone searchable, but only once, which is why I only run it at 1, maximum maybe 2. I don't like Cyclone as much because it only deals with one instance of back row, unlike True Nade, but unlike a card like, say, Photon Stream of Destruction, that's a nice segue, we're about to get into it, it can be used at any time. You don't have to have a specific monster on the field to be able to use it. You use it at any point in time to destroy a face-down piece of back row, and from the graveyard, it can be used to pop a face-up instance of back row, which is pretty damn nice. Now, I mentioned it already, you know what it is. This is one of the core features of the deck. Photon Stream of Destruction, obtainable by leveling up Kite Tenjo up to level 30. If I'm not mistaken, you get 3 copies of it. This is one of the most important cards in the deck, because if you control a Galaxy Eyes monster, target one card on the field, banish it. It can be your cards, it can be your opponent's cards, it can be face up, it can be face down, it can be back row, it can be monsters, it could be their Uncle Steven, it doesn't matter, banish that card, right? Now, this card is extremely useful offensively because, well, you're banishing cards. Assume that you go first, your opponent tries to set up on the next turn, you just banish whatever they hit the field with, like whatever it is, gone, right? Now, assume that you go second and your opponent is gone first and you're trying to go for that OTK, use Galaxy Cyclone or Hey True Nade to get rid of the back row, make your opening play, get Galaxy Eyes on the field, and then you just start banishing whatever's left on their field and going in for that lethal damage. This deck is very good at getting big numbers on the field in one turn, and this just paves the way for those big numbers to get your opponent's life points. Now, this card can only be used if you control Galaxy Eyes, but the whole point of this deck is to get Galaxy Eyes on the field. If you want to turn it into a bit less of a brick, then you can consider running it at 2. I've done that in the past, but just because of how useful it is in that OTK situation, I tend to run it at 3. Now, I talked about adding in other cards to do other things, offensive or defensive back row that you might want to toss in there. Now, for consistency's sake, you don't want to spam these kinds of things in your deck. However, support cards such as Book of Moon can be useful. You would generally maybe want to exchange something in the deck out in order to make room for this kind of back row, but these kinds of cards do not benefit your primary strategy in any way, but it's generic back row in case you get interrupted. You have to remember that your plan will not always work the way that you want it to, so in case of a brick, you might want to stall for time, or in case you get disrupted, you might need to stall for time. However, keep in mind that back row like this can end up becoming the reason why you brick in the first place. The same goes for cards like Treacherous Trap Hole, whatever you want to do. Some people just do all sorts of different things. I recommend keeping the deck list as small as possible, so choose what you want to do as your additional disruption, and I would say stick with that rather than having a little bit of everything in there. One of the last things to consider when building the deck is the new card Eternal Galaxy. Now, I run this card at 2, but hear me out. I only recently started doing this. I was running Book of Moon in place of Eternal Galaxy at 2 copies, but for the purposes of this showcase, I've chosen to go with this build. Now, I want to put this out there so you know right off the bat, you never search this card out using the skill, or at least you almost never do that, right? If you happen to draw into 1 copy, then great. You have an extending play, but do your opening combo as if this card did not exist in the deck, unless you already have like 2 Photon Streams of Destruction at your disposal. It's literally just for follow-up in case you need or want to make another play on the next turn. Before this card came out, like I said, I ran Book of Moon at 2, but I don't want too many potential bricks, so I've switched them out for the time being. Feel free to play around with your numbers, your ratios. There's positives and negatives to any additional backer that you would be adding into the deck, including this card. It can be a brick sometimes if you're unable to get into that starting play. You might have been better off opening, for instance, a Hey Trunade or a monster or something along those lines, but this is a 20 card build. Consistency is at the core of the deck, and it can be that last push that you need to win a game in a lot of situations, so I'm currently enjoying it, which is why I decided to include it in the deck list. Your extra deck is just a sea of light monsters. The skill only works if you have nothing but light monsters in your deck, but quite frankly, for whatever reason, the light monster gang just works really well with this deck. Neo Galaxy Eyes is at 1 since you'll rarely make it, and you'll more than likely only have the resources to do it once per duel anyway. If it comes out, the duel should be ending shortly after, hopefully, so I would say only 1 is necessary. Galaxion is at 2, so you have 2 chances of getting your Galaxy Eyes on the field from the deck, just in case. If your first attempt for an OTK gets disrupted and you're able to get into another Galaxion, you could still very easily win the game off of Galaxion's effect. In my opinion, top 3 cards in the entire archetype. We only have 2 in the game, but put both of them in this deck. Paladynamo is here because it fits the aesthetic, and the deck can make it if it needs to. It requires 2 light monsters. The deck needs to have only light monsters, and it's an extremely powerful card. You reduce your opponent's attack to 0, and you can just attack into them. You also negate their effects when doing this, so it can be really, really good to make that final push for lethal. It's basically just 2,000 free damage, and also if it gets destroyed, you get to draw 1 card, and this deck does not have a lot of draw power, so anything that it can get, it'll take it. All right, let's keep going. 1 Excalibur is nice if you have it. You can basically make the rest of the deck redundant sometimes if you have Excalibur, because if you're looking at an open field, Excalibur is 4,000 points of damage for a direct attack. There have been situations in which I've just gone straight for lethal with Excalibur rather than going through the entire opening play after I've used a Hey Trunade or something like that. The reason being, and I'll explain this more and get into more of the plays in the how to play video, but the primary reason for this is Galaxy Eyes doesn't actually have the potential to do a clean OTK. You can't really get exact lethal using Galaxy Eyes and Galaxion. You do 3,000, then 2,000, and then maybe an additional 2,000, but if your opponent has Battle Inbox or Veil, well then you're kind of stuck. Galaxy Eyes fails the OTK against Battle Inbox or Veil, however, Excalibur doesn't. So sometimes if you have reason to believe that that's a hand trap that your opponent has at their disposal and you have confidence that that will be lethal, it can be worth it to push for it. But if you don't get lethal with this card, that means you haven't done any of your other setups, so be very careful. And lastly, I have 1 Utopia and 1 Utopia Ray in the deck. Again, largely for the aesthetic, but quite frankly, how do I put it? With Photons, you're almost never going to need these cards in the extra deck. They're just there for extra utility in case you ever do. This is a very fast-paced deck, and you don't really need to do anything other than your primary strategy And if you do need to do something other than your primary strategy, then that means things have already gone very, very wrong, which is what these cards are for. It's light monsters that can be used for another form of OTK using Utopia Ray's effect, assuming that the duel has gone very far left and not in your favor. I personally do not use Necro Valley in my Galaxy Eyes deck, but bear in mind that you don't really need your graveyard for anything. Right? You don't need your graveyard, and so it just might be worth using Necro Valley to limit your opponent's plays and basically leaving yours unhindered. It's really just about thinking about tech that you can add in without clogging up that deck space. For instance, I've come across a couple of people, members of my community, who use Chaos Dragon Levianeer in the deck, and it's largely for the purpose of recovery. This deck doesn't have tons of recovery. If everything has gone wrong, you will have tons of light monsters in your graveyard off of Galaxion and Galaxy Eyes itself. You can get Chaos Dragon Levianeer on the field. You can either use its effect to bring a Galaxy Eyes back onto the field alongside it, or you just have a really big beat stick on the field to make use of. Chaos Dragon Levianeer can be summoned by banishing 3 light monsters from your graveyard, in case you didn't know that. So yeah. Another important card to note is number 18. It's a light level 4 XYZ monster, which means that you can put it into the deck, the skill will still work perfectly, and this card is the perfect counter to Harpies, because if 2 or more monsters of the same name are on the field at the same time, this card has the ability to target one of them and destroy all monsters of that name whenever they are summoned, so it completely shuts down the Harpy archetype. Now, Harpies won't always be relevant, which is why I didn't put it into the main deck list. However, while they are, and if there is ever a deck that also uses cards of the same name, this card is a perfect fit into the Photon deck. It works with the skill, and it would just require a little bit of shifting around with the extra deck. So yeah, that's the deck. That's how you build it, in my opinion, keeping focus as your primary objective, making sure that you are keeping your eyes on that OTK, not adding in any unnecessary extra things. Trying to keep it at 20 cards, in my opinion, is the best way to go. Obviously, there are going to be other builds, and feel free to take a look at other people who have other opinions on the deck. These are just my thoughts on how to get the most consistent deck list going. With that being said, if you enjoyed the video, please do consider liking. It really does help me out. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the archetype and builds that you might be considering, things that you might enjoy putting into the deck, and consider subscribing, because again, it really helps out the channel. But more importantly, we're going to be talking a lot more about photons in the coming days, weeks, so if you enjoyed this video, it's likely that you'll enjoy those ones too. With that being said, I've been Saul. I hope you've been informed and entertained, and bye.